the different types of relationships that we're going to talk about, whether it's parents, siblings, children, husbands, spouses. Um, and it's interesting because you bring up younger kids, but I mean,
Mhm.
there's women of all ages listening to this show. So
Sure.
the same sort of, uh, you know, kind of that feeling we get with people in our life can really, I mean, it could apply to grandchildren too. I don't have grandchildren yet, but I know that's going to be another, another relationship, and that's going to be interesting to see how all that rolls out. So yeah, let's start with parents. Maybe we'll just start at the top.
Okay.
So, what about your relationship? And I know you wrote a little bit about this in your book. There's a couple chapters that you referred to parent relationships. So, what was that like for you?
Yeah.
And I like the before and after because obviously we've changed. Diabetes has changed. Our
Mhm.
care has changed.
Yeah.
Our access to different tools and pumps and all the things.
Right.
So and then there's the obvious dynamic that guess what? We're not living at home anymore. So our parents, I mean, in most cases, most of us that are listening, are not living with our parents. And so that's another dynamic of the relationship. So I wonder, yeah. So
Yeah.
what's
I
what's
think,
kind of been, yeah, your story with that from
yeah,
then and now?
I think in the beginning, I mean, my parents both sort of reacted in a similar way when I was diagnosed. I was 12
Mm-hmm.
when I was diagnosed.
Mm-hmm.
No one in my family has type 1. Go back generations, go out to cousins and aunts and uncles and I mean, just keep going. It's not there. And so it
Mm-hmm.
was kind of are you sure at first?
Mm-hmm.
Which I totally understand. I mean, this is not something we were used to dealing with. And then it was kind of what are we going to do? Like if this is true, how do we handle this? How do
Mm-hmm.
we move forward? How do we parent, and deal with this, chronic illness every day now?
Yeah.
And so they both kind of were in shock at first, and then sort of how do we deal with this? Um, and I alluded to this earlier. I grew up with divorced parents. They were divorced when I was 3, and I wasn't diagnosed until 12. And so they were divorced at my diagnosis. And I lived primarily with my mom, but I saw my dad regularly. He was right there in our hometown and very active in our lives for my sister and myself. Um, but I remember my mom being just pretty vigilant about it all, balanced nutrition, which honestly, she was pretty good with that beforehand. And so that wasn't like an enormous change. But always checking numbers, checking in with me, how are things, always going to the endo appointments, always having regular, like sugar on hand, just in case. She was
Mm-hmm.
that mom. But I was also 12 when I was diagnosed, which I think is uh, different than being, 3. And I think I grew up pretty quickly once I was diagnosed. I was kind of like the mature for your age kind of kid anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think it just pushed the gas pedal on that. I talk about that a little bit in day 10 in my book when I talk about, my dad's reaction, and just sort of mourning the loss of my childhood. And that's something that he went through. And I remember, wanting to do shots just a couple weeks after being diagnosed. And that way I could manage stuff at mom's, I could manage stuff at dad's. I wasn't like relying on someone. It was that kind of thing. Uh, but that's kind of like the early days.
Yeah.
That answers that part of your question.
And well, nowadays there is more help out there, but back in our time in the 80s and 90s, there
Yeah,
was no how-to books, how to parent
really.
your child with
Yeah,
diabetes, right? Everybody was really learning.
yeah,
It was a crash course and it was really day to day, wasn't it?
it was.
Yeah, it was just learning as you go. Interesting because my childhood was a lot different. There was really no connection to the disease at all.
Hmm.
Lack of understanding it or
Hmm.
learning or um, and I don't know if that was I really don't know what to point that to. I think it might have been part that there was not as much information out there to seek. But I didn't actively see my parents seeking or asking questions.
Hmm.
So they minimized it, so I minimized it
Yep.
for way too long.
Yeah.
Interesting. It's interesting how you kind of take on that relationship with a disease based on the leaders of the home, the parents that are kind of, you know, leading the home. I guess that's the right term. It's the only thing I can think of really to, but they are, us children were to follow them and to do. Um, it's interesting. It's really interesting. Not something I can take back, but it definitely explained my disconnection from it for years because they didn't think it was a big deal. So I didn't think it was a big deal.
Of course.
Oh, I know. All right. Because as a kid, you don't really know how to feel about anything. I was 14. I guess, and that's kind of interesting too, because maybe the part of me was just kind of separated from it. Um, but yeah, that relationship to this day makes me feel not important,
Yeah.
and I think at the time I didn't know any different, but I can look back now and say, gosh, if my daughter had been diagnosed at any age, right? My gosh, I'd be hot on it.
Exactly.
With anything, because that would be my natural response. But again, we can't change it back. But I can look back and learn from it and just
Yeah.
understanding that was the kind of dynamic that my household had. And I
Hmm.
always say, I just, they did the best they could with what they knew and what they had. And so I can't judge or, have any sort of really thoughts around that now. Yeah,
I do think there's value in not making diabetes everything,
there's that
because
too.
there's that middle line where
Mm-hmm.
you feel valued and important enough to take care of, and like,
Mm-hmm.
this a serious illness that we need to
Mm-hmm.
monitor and act appropriately, that kind of a thing. But I think if we go too far, it can become our focal point and we can sort of build our lives all around it,
You're
or
true.
build our relationships all around it. And it kind of becomes our identity, which we've talked about before. And I just don't think
Absolutely.
that's healthy either. I think there's some
Right.
sort of a middle ground there that we
Mm-hmm.
just need to find, to operate in.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, that's a really good point. And that kind of points to other kids in the house. So growing up, you had siblings, I had siblings. That's
Mhm.
another dynamic too, because I think, there can be that, well, this one child is getting all the attention, and that just puts more stress on mom and dad or other family members as to, you obviously want to devote time and attention to what's important medically, without taking away from, you know,
Mhm.
the other
Yes.
kids and the other relationships. Now,
Yeah.
do you remember anything specifically with that?
Yes. Yeah. Well, and it's something that I wrote about on the blog. But I text my mom, and I text her while I was writing the book,
Mm,
and just said, "Hey, I've got a random question for you." I was just kind of like digging for leads on what I could write about relationally. And I just asked her, "Hey, did you go through a period of time after my diagnosis that, like, you wondered if you did something to cause it,
mm,
or you didn't do something to prevent it, or what did
mm,
we do to deserve this?" Kind of a, I don't know what's out there, but did you feel anything like that? And her response was, I'm going to read this from the blog. "It all happened so quickly that I didn't have much time to think about it at all. I do remember the
mm,
hospital staff telling us that there was absolutely nothing either of us did or didn't do to cause it. I
mm,
remember feeling helpless that I couldn't fix it, and
mm,
several times waking up in the morning thinking it had all been a dream." But she said, overall, my main focus was to try to keep everything as normal as possible so that you and your sister wouldn't be scared, even though I was scared. And so I remember her, which I I dive into that in the blog and kind of pick that apart. And I'm like, nobody needs to carry that weight. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that is just, that's, we gotta figure that one out and
Yeah.
get out of that feeling of I have to control it all and I have to like figure this out and make sure everybody's happy and it like we can't carry that.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember her saying, we were talking about it further, and she was like, I remember mealtime and I didn't want it to be weird. I didn't want to change the things that we were already doing as a family. And I didn't want to make it weird for her. And I'm like, yeah. Because if
Yeah,
one of your
interesting.
kids comes down with whatever they get, you are, of course, dealing with them. You're, of course, dealing with yourself mentally, emotionally, all the things.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you've got another kid, it's like, okay, I've got to figure out for them what does this mean for them? And how do I navigate it to protect them to an extent, but also educate them? And it's a dance.
It's